The report arrived in the conclave's administrative archive on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to the Veth, who did not measure time in days, but everything to the single human clerk who filed it, because Tuesday was the day her mother had died, 3 years prior, and she had learned to be careful on Tuesdays. Her name was Mara Voss. She was 29 years old, unremarkable in every way that could be measured from the outside, and she had been working as a records specialist for the Galactic Conclave's Human Integration Bureau for 14 months. She was not a soldier. She was not a diplomat. She held no rank that mattered, carried no weapon, commanded no fleet. She processed documentation. She cross-referenced incident reports. She filed things. And on that Tuesday, she filed a report that no one was supposed to read. She had not intended to read it herself. The document had arrived misrouted, a bureaucratic error that happened more often than the conclave's architects of perfect administrative logic would ever publicly admit. The header designated it as a routine xenobiological survey from a fringe system near the outer reach. The content was something else entirely. Mara read the first 3 paragraphs before she set down her coffee. She read the next 6 before she understood what she was looking at. Then she closed the file, sat very still for approximately 4 minutes, and made a decision that she could not have fully explained to anyone. Not because it was irrational, but because the full weight of what she had decided would not become clear to her, or to anyone else, for a very long time. She did not report the misrouting. She kept the file. She went home at the end of her shift, ate a meal she would not later remember, and sat in the dark of her apartment on a station orbiting a planet she had never visited, and thought about what it meant that the conclave had formally, quietly, and without any public announcement, classified humanity as a Category 7 existential variable. She did not know, yet, what a Category 7 existential variable was. She would find out. And that process of finding out, that slow, grinding, increasingly terrifying process, would become something the galaxy would spend decades trying to understand and never fully succeed. The Veth coordinator assigned to the Human Integration Bureau was named Sci-Fi, and he had spent 11 years managing what the conclave internally referred to as the human file, a designation so bureaucratically mundane that it successfully disguised the reality that no single administrative portfolio in the conclave's 4,000-year history had generated more internal debate, more contradictory assessment reports, or more emergency reclassifications than the ongoing question of what precisely to do about the species from the third planet of a yellow dwarf star in the Orion Arm. Sci-Fi was not cruel. This was important. He was not indifferent, not dismissive, not contemptuous in the way that lower administrative functionaries sometimes were when dealing with species that had only recently achieved interstellar contact. He was, in the estimation of his colleagues, one of the most thoughtful senior coordinators the Bureau had employed in living memory. He had read more human literature than any non-human official in the conclave. He had studied the wars, the art, the philosophy. He had watched recordings of human laughter and human grief with the careful attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, and he had still gotten it wrong. He had gotten it wrong in a specific way that would later be recognized as the foundational error, the one miscalculation from which all subsequent mistakes cascaded with the terrible logic of dominoes designed to fall in exactly the wrong direction. He had concluded, after 11 years of careful study, that humans were fundamentally reactive. They responded to threat. They escalated in response to aggression. They were driven by fear, by loss, by perceived injustice. If you removed the provocation, you removed the response. If you managed the conditions carefully enough, if you controlled the variables with sufficient precision, humans would remain exactly where you placed them. He had written this conclusion into a formal assessment. The assessment had been read by 47 senior conclave officials. It had been incorporated into policy. It was the kind of mistake that looks reasonable right up until the moment the thing you have confidently misunderstood begins, very quietly, to move. Mara spent 3 weeks cross-referencing before she called her friend. His name was Dr. Pieter Edelman, and he was the kind of man who had been called paranoid so many times by so many people that he had eventually stopped arguing about it, and simply accepted the label as a reasonable working description. He was 44, a xenolinguist who had spent 12 years working on conclave translation projects before a series of disagreements about methodology, and, he maintained, about conclusions, had resulted in his reassignment to a research position so peripheral that it barely justified the title. He worked out of a cramped office on a station that the conclave classified as a secondary administrative node, which was the institutional equivalent of being moved to a room without windows. When Mara sent him the file, he did not respond for 6 hours. When he did respond, he sent 2 words, "Call me." The conversation lasted 4 hours. It was the first of many. What Mara had found, what she had spent 3 weeks carefully, methodically verifying, was not a single document. It was a pattern. The misrouted survey had been one piece of something much larger, and once she knew what to look for, the shape of it began to emerge from the conclave's administrative records the way a face emerges from a crowd when you finally recognize who you're looking for. The conclave had been quietly reclassifying human population centers for 11 months, not on any public registry, not in any document accessible to human officials with standard clearance. The reclassifications used a coding system she had initially taken for a survey designation, but Pieter recognized it immediately, with a particular silence that preceded his explanation that suggested he had suspected something like this for a very long time. The code was a containment category, not quarantine, not medical. Containment in the strategic sense, a classification system the conclave had developed over centuries for managing species whose development trajectories had been assessed as incompatible with conclave stability. There were, according to the documents Mara had found, 6 species in the conclave's history that had ever been placed in active containment status. 2 of them no longer existed. The galaxy, it should be understood, had not made its decision about humanity out of malice. This was the part that Mara kept returning to in those early weeks, turning it over in the dark of her apartment, while the station hummed around her, and the stars outside her window looked exactly the way stars had always looked, indifferent and enormous and present. It had been a calculation, a rational, evidence-based, carefully deliberated calculation made by intelligent beings who had been managing interstellar civilization for longer than human civilization had been drawing on cave walls. They had assessed the available data. They had applied established models. They had reached a conclusion. The conclusion was that humanity, left on its current developmental trajectory, represented a statistical probability of destabilization that the conclave could not absorb. Not because humans were powerful, not because they were aggressive exactly. The conclave had managed aggressive species before. The Cathari had been aggressive in ways that made human warfare look like an argument over parking, and the conclave had incorporated the Cathari within 3 centuries. The assessment of humanity was more specific, and in some ways more disturbing, than a simple evaluation of aggression. The conclave's analysts had identified something in human behavior that did not fit any existing model they possessed. Something that emerged consistently across every historical data set, every sociological projection, every attempt to run the standard developmental algorithms. Humans, when they decided something mattered, did not stop. This sounds simple. It sounds almost trivial. The conclave's analysts had initially treated it as a quantitative variable, a higher-than-average persistence index, something to be noted and accommodated. They had run the models. The models broke. Not because humans were more persistent than expected, because the persistence itself seemed to be unconnected from any rational calculation of cost. The standard models assumed that any sufficiently advanced species would apply an optimization function to continued effort, that at some point the cost of continuing would exceed the assessed value of the objective, and the species would redirect resources, retreat, adapt, find a different approach. Humans applied this optimization function to almost everything, almost, in a specific subset of situations that the conclave's analysts could identify but could not reliably predict in advance. Humans stopped calculating. The decision to continue was no longer a decision. It became something that functioned more like weather, like gravity, like a property of the universe rather than a choice within it. The conclave had no model for this. They had tried to build one for 8 years. The models broke every time. And so, with the careful, sorrowful logic of a civilization that had learned over millennia that some problems cannot be solved after the fact. They had decided to solve the human problem before it became a human problem. Mara had been afraid in those first weeks that she was wrong, that she was misreading the documents, that there was an explanation she didn't have the clearance to access, some context that would make the containment classifications reasonable and the two extinct species coincidental. She looked for that explanation with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. She looked for it the way she had looked for her mother's misplaced medication in the last weeks of her mother's life, carefully, completely, in every drawer and cabinet and corner, because the alternative to finding it was something she was not prepared to accept. She did not find it. What she found instead was worse. Piotr found it, technically. He had been pulling historical records on the two extinct species, a process that required navigating 11 layers of archival classification, which he accomplished with a patience and creativity that Mara found, in retrospect, slightly alarming. And what he found was that neither species had been destroyed by the conclave directly. The containment protocol did not work like that. It was more elegant, more deniable, more careful. You did not destroy a species. You shaped the conditions around them. You managed the resources they could access, the alliances they could form, the information they could obtain. You created, over decades, a gradually tightening set of circumstances that the species would interpret as natural, as bad luck, as political complexity, as the ordinary friction of a complicated galaxy, while the actual structure of those circumstances was anything but ordinary. And then, at some point in that process, the species would encounter a crisis that they simply did not have the resources to survive. Not because the conclave had manufactured the crisis. Sometimes the conclave had. Sometimes not. It didn't matter. The containment protocol worked precisely because it didn't require the conclave to do anything dramatic. It just required patience and precision, and the willingness to hold the shape of a cage so subtle that the thing inside never stopped believing it was free. Mara sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Piotr what she was thinking about doing. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You know that if we report this through official channels, those channels are the thing we're reporting about." "Yes," Mara said. "And if we try to go public, we have no way of knowing how much of the public information infrastructure is already managed." "Yes. And if we try to warn people, warn humans specifically, in any coordinated way, we're going to look exactly like the thing the conclave says we are." Mara looked out the window at the stars. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that. And I think," she said carefully, "that we need to think about this the way the conclave isn't expecting us to think about it." Another silence. "Then, what does that mean?" "It means," Mara said, "that every time the conclave ran a model on human behavior, the model broke because they were asking the wrong question. They were asking what humans would do when the cost got too high. They were trying to find the point where we'd stop." "Right. But that's not actually the unpredictable part," Mara said. "The unpredictable part is what we do before we stop. The part where we haven't stopped yet and we're still running and we're willing to lose things we can't get back." She paused. "The conclave is going to expect us to try to escape the cage, or fight it, or expose it." "Those aren't the same thing," Piotr said slowly. "No," Mara agreed. "They're not. And that's exactly the problem, because if we fight, we look like what they said we are. If we try to run, we confirm the assessment. If we expose it, we need infrastructure we don't control." She paused again. "But there's a fourth option that I don't think appears anywhere in their models, because there's no historical precedent for it." "What's the fourth option?" Mara thought about her mother, about Tuesdays, about the particular quality of attention required to look for something in every single drawer when you already know it might not be there, but you keep looking anyway, because the looking is the only thing you can control. "We make them need us," she said. "Before they finish." Siv Oreth noticed the anomaly on a morning that was, by Veth reckoning, the 42nd day of the third administrative cycle, which was a distinction that mattered to him in ways that the human concept of Tuesday never quite had. The anomaly was small. A series of resource allocation requests from 3 separate human-operated stations in the outer reach, all filed through standard channels, all individually unremarkable. It was only when you looked at all 3 simultaneously, something no automated system had flagged, because each request fell within normal parameters, that the pattern became visible. The three stations were each requesting components that, in isolation, served obvious standard purposes. Together, they were requesting everything needed to construct a long-range relay node. Specifically, a relay node of the type that the Conclave did not publicly acknowledge existed, a type that could carry communications through the subspace interference bands that the Conclave's managed information network relied on for signal suppression. Someone had figured out the suppression system, or at least, someone had figured out enough of it to know what a relay node that bypassed it would need to be built from. Steve Orath read the requests 3 times. Then he flagged them for interception, which was standard procedure, and recommended that all 3 stations receive an expedited compliance review, which was a bureaucratic mechanism that allowed the Conclave to delay resource delivery for up to 18 months under the guise of administrative verification. He considered briefly whether he should escalate the concern. He decided against it. The relay node components intercepted would never arrive. Without them, whoever had begun this project would hit a wall. They would try something else, and that something else would be observable and manageable. What he did not know, what he had no model for, was that the relay node was not the plan. The relay node was the request that was supposed to be noticed. Mara heard from a contact at one of the 3 stations within 12 hours of the interception. The contact, a systems engineer named Rao who had been part of her growing, careful, never quite explicitly organized network of people who had begun to understand what was happening, reported the interception with the particular flat affect of someone who had expected it. "Good," Mara said. Rao was quiet for a moment. "I want to make sure I understand the plan." "The plan is that they just used a compliance review to lock up administrative bandwidth for 3 stations in the outer reach," Mara said. "That review requires documentation. The documentation requires official processing. The processing routes through 4 different administrative offices, 2 of which are currently understaffed because of a budget reallocation that happened 6 weeks ago." "Right. And every official who touches that documentation has to log their involvement. Which means their attention is logged, which means for the next 18 months we know exactly where 3 sets of Conclave eyes are going to be pointed." Another silence, longer this time. "You're using their bureaucracy against them." "I'm using their certainty against them," Mara said. "They're certain we're trying to build a relay node. They're going to spend 18 months being certain about that. And while they're certain we're going to do something that doesn't look like anything because it isn't the kind of thing that shows up in their models. What if they figure it out?" Mara thought about this seriously, the way she thought about everything. "Then we lose that part," she said, "and we find another part. We have more parts than they think we have." "How do you know that?" "Because," Mara said, "they keep running models on what we'll do. And every time we do something unexpected, they build a new model to accommodate it. But they can only model things they've seen. And we keep doing things they've never seen." She did not say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that this was both humanity's greatest advantage and its most terrible cost, that the willingness to do things no one had ever done before required, inevitably, a willingness to pay prices no one had yet calculated. She was beginning to understand what some of those prices might be. She was trying not to think about them directly. Thinking about them directly made her hands shake, and she needed her hands to be steady. It was a researcher in the Conclave's xenobiological division who first used the phrase that would later be translated, somewhat inadequately, as the human recursion problem. Her name was Dr. Vale Sin, a Korathi who had spent 20 years studying what the Conclave called developmental anomalies in emerging species, and who had, by her own account, never lost sleep over a research subject before. She lost sleep over humans. The specific thing she could not resolve, the thing that kept surfacing in her data and refusing to be integrated into any framework she trusted, was the relationship between human suffering and human capability. In every other species the Conclave had studied, suffering was a cost. It depleted resources, reduced function, narrowed focus. Even highly resilient species treated suffering as something to be minimized and recovered from, because the logic of that was inescapable. An organism in pain is an organism operating below capacity. Humans suffered, and then, With a consistency that Dr. Vale Sin found quietly unbearable, they incorporated the suffering. It didn't deplete them in the expected way. It changed them. Sometimes it broke them. She had ample data on human psychological collapse, and it was not a phenomenon she minimized. But in the cases she found herself unable to stop analyzing, the suffering had done something else. It had made them precise, not faster, not stronger, not measurably more intelligent, but precise in a particular way, as if the suffering had burned away everything that was not absolutely essential, and what remained was a version of the human being that had a quality of focus that she lacked the proper terminology to describe. She had tried to model it. The models broke. She had written a note in her research file, encrypted under her personal access credentials, that she had never submitted to any official report. I think we have made an error. I think the category of threat we have assigned to this species is correct, but the nature of the threat is wrong. We have been watching what they do. We have not been understanding why they continue to do it. These are not the same thing. She had written it and then locked it and gone back to her data because she was a scientist, and the data was what she had, and the data had to mean something even if she couldn't yet see what. She did not know yet that Mara Voss existed. She did not know that somewhere in the Conclave's own administrative infrastructure, a 29-year-old records specialist was building something that had no name and no precedent and no model that could have predicted it, precisely because it was built from materials that no model treated as building materials. Attention, patience, grief, and the specific kind of irrational certainty that comes from knowing something is wrong and being unwilling to stop knowing it. The moment that changed everything, or rather, the moment that revealed that everything had already changed, came 14 months after Mara read the misrouted report. It did not come with a battle. It did not come with a speech. It came in the form of an inquiry from Steve Orath himself, directed to the Human Integration Bureau's Records Office, requesting verification of the employment status of a specific records specialist. The request was routine. Compliance reviews sometimes prompted this kind of verification. It was procedure. Mara processed the inquiry herself. This was, technically, a conflict of interest. She processed it anyway, with the particular care of someone who had been thinking about exactly this moment for 11 months. She verified her own employment status as current, unremarkable, and fully compliant. She flagged the verification as completed. She routed the completed flag through the standard processing queue, where it would sit for between 3 and 6 weeks before reaching Steve Orath's attention, which was normal. Then she sent a message to Peter, and to Rao, and to the other 14 people in her network, people who had never met each other, who communicated only through channels they had built themselves from components that individually meant nothing. And the message said 2 words: "It's time." What followed over the next 72 hours was not, from the outside, visible as anything dramatic. No communication spiked. No resource requests triggered flags. No stations went dark. No ships altered course. No alerts fired in any conclave monitoring system. What happened was that information moved quietly through the gaps in a surveillance infrastructure that had been designed to catch what the conclave expected humans to do. Information moved through those gaps the way water moves through the cracks in something that looks solid until the moment it doesn't. The information was, at its core, simple. Here is what is happening to you. Here is how long it has been happening. Here is evidence. Here is more evidence. Here is how we know it is evidence and not something else. But attached to that information was something else. Something that Mara had spent 14 months building with the same patient precision she had applied to finding the shape of the cage. A structure of documentation, of cross-referenced records, of carefully preserved bureaucratic trails, all pointing in one direction. The Conclave's containment protocol had been applied to humanity based on a formal risk assessment, and that assessment, Mara had discovered, had not been unanimous. 7 of the 47 officials who had read the assessment had dissented. Their dissents had been classified and removed from the official record. Their objections had been, in the language of conclave procedure, administratively resolved, which was a phrase that meant in practice that they had been transferred or reassigned, or in 2 cases promoted out of positions where their objections might have mattered. But the records of those objections still existed. Because bureaucracies, even 4,000-year-old bureaucracies of enormous sophistication and reach, generate paper. They generate documentation. They generate trails, and trails are the one thing that does not disappear simply because someone would prefer it had. Mara had found the trails. She had found them the way you find anything in the dark, slowly, methodically, with the kind of patience that comes not from confidence but from the refusal to consider the alternative. And now those trails were moving through the galaxy's information networks, translated into 47 languages, formatted for comprehension by species whose cognitive architecture she had spent 3 months studying just enough to understand how they would read them, reaching conclave members who had no idea what was coming, reaching journalists operating in information spaces the conclave did not fully control, reaching the 7 dissenting officials themselves, 2 of whom, as it turned out, had been waiting for something that looked exactly like this. Steve Orath received the briefing on the 4th day. His personal description of his reaction, recorded in a private document that was later obtained through the same archival methods he had spent 14 months failing to make inaccessible to humans, was characteristically precise. I had expected, he wrote, that if this project failed, and I had assessed it as likely to fail, it would fail in a way that confirmed our assessment. I expected that the human response would be reactive, emotional, or strategically transparent. I expected that they would overreach or panic or attempt something that confirmed what we believed about their developmental stage. Instead, it appears that for 14 months, a records specialist with no formal training in intelligence operations, no political connections, no institutional backing, and no access to resources beyond her immediate professional role, systematically mapped our administrative infrastructure using only publicly available documentation and misrouted paperwork, identified the legal and institutional vulnerabilities in our assessment process, built a distribution network from components we had no reason to monitor, and released, with precise timing, information calibrated to be most effective in the specific institutional context where we were least prepared to manage it. I am writing this because I need to understand it, and I find that I cannot. The models predicted reactive behavior. What we received was something that had been running silently before we knew there was anything to watch for. She was not reacting to us. We were, it appears, reacting to her. We simply did not know it until now. I do not know how to classify this. I do not know what model accommodates it. I suspect the correct answer is that no such model exists, which is itself a finding of considerable significance. I should note one additional detail that I cannot make sense of in terms of our existing frameworks. The records specialist in question, during the entire 14-month period, did not alter her observable behavior in any way that triggered automated monitoring flags. She arrived at work on time. She processed documentation at her normal rate. Her performance reviews were unremarkable. She ate lunch at the same hour. The only behavioral anomaly that appears in her monitoring record is this: every 3 to 4 weeks, she filed for a personal access request to view historical records in a category unrelated to her professional role. The category she selected, consistently, was records of extinct species. We logged this as a standard academic interest. The category is publicly accessible. The access was never flagged. I believe now that she was reading those records as a kind of threat. Not of what she might do to us. Of what, 14 months ago, we had already decided to do to her. Dr. Vale Sin read Steve Orath's report when it was released during the subsequent investigation. A different kind of release, institutional rather than intentional. The kind of release that happens when a bureaucratic structure begins to fracture under the weight of its own internal contradictions. She read it in her office late, when the lights in the station corridor outside had dimmed to their night cycle, and she sat with it for a long time. She thought about her research, about the relationship between suffering and precision, about the things she had never found adequate language for, the quality that emerged in humans who had been through something and come out the other side not intact, exactly, but focused in a way that frightened her slightly even as it compelled her. She thought about a records specialist who had spent 14 months eating lunch at the same hour every day. She thought about what it cost to do that, to move through your ordinary life with the knowledge she had carried, doing the ordinary things, not showing anything, not breaking, She thought about the kind of interior architecture that required. The kind of thing you had to build inside yourself to hold a shape like that for 14 months. She opened her encrypted research file. She found the note she had written and never submitted. "I think we have made an error." She added a line. "I think the error was not in our assessment of what they might do. I think the error was in our assumption that we would be able to watch them do it." She saved the file. Then she wrote a formal report, the first she had submitted in 9 months, that said what she actually believed, recommending that all existing risk assessment models for human behavior be suspended, not because humans were less dangerous than assessed, but because the assessment category was wrong. She did not recommend reclassification as non-threatening. She recommended reclassification as unknown, because unknown was honest. Unknown meant that the models didn't apply. Unknown meant you were still in the part of the process where you were trying to understand the thing rather than manage it, and that distinction, she had come to believe, was the only place from which you could avoid making catastrophic errors. The report was, after some deliberation, accepted. Not by everyone, not without resistance, but accepted, and that was something. Mara found out through the same channels she had built for everything else, slowly, incompletely, with significant gaps that she spent weeks cross-referencing to fill. She was sitting in her apartment on a station that had been officially reclassified 3 months prior as a secondary administrative node, not because of the investigation officially, but the timing was precise in a way she had learned to read. Outside her window, the stars looked the way they always looked. Piotr called. "They suspended the containment protocol," he said. Mara did not say anything for a moment. "Suspended," she said. "Not canceled. Suspended pending review. The review committee includes 2 of the 7 dissenting officials." She processed this. "And the other 5, a pause that told her everything before he said anything. 4 are still in reassigned positions. 1 died 2 years ago. Natural causes according to the record." "According to the record," Mara said. "I know." She thought about the 2 extinct species. She thought about patience and precision. She thought about 14 months of lunch at the same hour. She thought about her mother and about Tuesdays and about the particular character of looking for something in every drawer when the stakes of not finding it are irreversible. "We need to keep watching," she said. "I know that too." "The suspension is real," she said. "The investigation is real, but the thing that produced the assessment in the first place is still there. The institution is still there. The logic is still there. We showed them that the process can be challenged. We haven't shown them why it should never have started. Can we show them that?" Mara looked at the stars. She thought about what it had cost to get here, the people in her network who had made themselves visible, who had taken risks that had not been uniformly consequence-free. She thought about Rao, who had been transferred after the compliance review in a way that was documented as routine and was not. She thought about the price of every step forward and the price of the steps still ahead, and the fact that the counting of prices was itself a kind of trap, because if you counted too carefully, you would eventually conclude that the math didn't work. And the math, looked at correctly, didn't work. It had never worked. It would never work. The cost of what they were doing and what they would need to keep doing was not something you could balance against the alternative and arrive at a clean answer. The alternative was what happened to those 2 extinct species, and you could not put a number on that. You could only decide whether you were willing to continue. "I don't know," Mara said honestly, "but I think we keep going until we do." The conclave's formal inquiry took 3 years. It produced 11,000 pages of documentation. It confirmed that the containment protocol had been implemented without full council authorization. It confirmed that the dissenting voices had been suppressed. It confirmed that 2 other species currently in containment status were now the subject of urgent reassessment. It did not confirm everything Mara had found, because she had found some things that could not yet be confirmed, and some things that she had chosen, deliberately, not to release. Not because they weren't true, because timing mattered. Because knowing when to hold a thing was as important as knowing when to release it, and she had learned this over 14 months of doing it. The inquiry's final recommendation, the one that generated the most debate in the conclave's internal communications, the one that was argued over and amended and argued over again before being adopted, was not what anyone expected. It did not recommend reclassification of humanity as safe. It did not recommend integration as full members. It did not recommend any of the standard outcomes that the existing framework provided for, because the existing framework, as Dr. Vale Sin's report had noted, was built on models that did not apply. The recommendation, in its final form, was this: the Human Integration Bureau should be restructured as a mutual liaison office. The classification system should be suspended for all human-related assessments. The conclave should proceed on the basis that human behavior is not currently predictable using existing models, and that this unpredictability represents neither a confirmed threat nor a confirmed benignity, but rather evidence that our models require fundamental revision. We do not know, at this time, what humans will do. We know that they have demonstrated the capacity to act with precision, patience, strategic sophistication, and willingness to bear personal cost across time horizons that exceed our model's assumptions. We know that they appear to apply these capacities specifically in response to perceived injustice, and that the response, once committed to, does not follow the attenuation curves we have observed in other species. We recommend humility. We recommend transparency. We recommend that the conclave proceed with the assumption that humans are already watching, and that what they do with what they observe will not necessarily be what we expect. We recommend this not as a concession of weakness, but as a recognition of our current state of knowledge. The alternative is to continue assuming we understand what we do not, which is how we arrived at the current situation. Mara read the recommendation on a Tuesday. She was still in her apartment on the same station. Stars outside were the same stars, indifferent and enormous and present, the way stars always were. She read the document in full carefully, the way she read everything. Then she saved it to her personal archive, which was encrypted in a way that had taken her 2 months to devise, and she wrote a note at the bottom of the document in her own hand, the way her mother had written notes in margins. The note said, "This is not the end. This is the part where they think they understand what happened. Keep watching. Keep the network, keep the trails." She made herself coffee. She drank it slowly. Peter called, and she let it ring twice before answering, not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned in 14 months that the moments between one thing and the next deserved to be felt. "They're calling it a victory," he said. "It's a beginning," Mara said. "Is there a difference?" "A victory is something you can stop after," she said. "A beginning is something you have to keep doing." She heard him breathe. Outside, the station's environmental systems shifted into their night cycle, and the lights softened, and the stars remained exactly where they had always been. "I need you to do something," she said. "I need you to start looking at the historical records on the 2 species currently in reassessment. I need to know whether the suspension of their containment is real, or whether it's another kind of management. That could take months." "Yes," Mara said. "It will." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that months was fine. Months was what they had always had. The galaxy for 4,000 years had operated on the assumption that it had time to manage, to observe, to wait for the predictable response. It had been right about every species it had ever assessed. It had not been right about humans because it had not understood what humans use time for: not waiting, not recovering, not retreating, building. Slowly in the dark, from whatever materials were available, without any guarantee of success, sustained by something that the conclave's models called irrationality because they had no better word for it, the decision to keep going, not because the math worked, but because stopping was the only thing that was clearly, completely, and permanently wrong. The galaxy had looked at humanity and seen a threat. It had not looked long enough to see what kind. Not the kind that destroys. Not the kind that conquers. The kind that watches and waits and builds things in the dark, and keeps building them long after every rational civilization would have accepted that the dark was permanent. The kind that files the report, that reads it twice, that sits very still for 4 minutes and then decides. The kind that eats lunch at the same hour for 14 months and calls it survival. Somewhere in the conclave's administrative archive, Mara Voss's employment record still described her as unremarkable. She had never asked for it to be changed. She thought sometimes that it was the most important document she had ever filed. It was Tuesday. She finished her coffee. She went back to work.